Today we have a game between Nicolas Petrashvili and Giga Kupadze, which was played in the 2023 Georgian National Championship. Petrashvili, an international master, has the white pieces, and Kupadze, a grandmaster rated 20 points higher, has the black pieces. Petrashvili begins the game with e4, and Kupadze decides to respond with c5, Sicilian defense. The Sicilian is the second most common response to e4 after e5, but it has so much theory that we will not go into it right now. The main responses for white are to play either the open Sicilian with knight f3 or the closed Sicilian with knight c3. White in this game decides to play knight f3, the open Sicilian. The idea is to play d4 and get an active position with open lines to black's king. Black responds with the Taimanov variation with e6. So white strikes in the middle with d4. Black's best move is to make this trade with c takes d4, and then knight takes d4. Black goes into a sideline of the Taimanov with a6, which is known as the Khan variation. And the idea is to prevent a piece, either a bishop or a knight, from landing on this weak square, which is a big weakness usually in these Sicilian positions. White plays bishop d3, putting his bishop behind his pawn, anticipating the fact that this pawn will either be traded or somehow the line will open up. Black responds with the main line, which is to play knight e7. It looks like a pretty counterintuitive move because you block in your bishop here from getting out, but the idea is that you can A, get one step closer to castling your king side, and B, you can support a push with d5 or maybe even f5 into the center. And here, white makes an inaccuracy by engine standards. The move bishop e3 is not highly regarded by the engine because it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. It does reinforce this knight so that after white does get this bishop out, there's no tempo on the knight here. But other than that, it kind of just wastes a move. Here, black decides to push into the center with d5. The queen supports the d5 pawn as well as the knight and another pawn, so that pawn is not going anywhere even if this trade happens. Black capitalizes on white's inaccuracy and waste of a move by pushing directly into the middle with d5. That pawn push is supported by a pawn and the knight and the queen, so it is strong and probably not going anywhere. White decides to castle here. It's a good move, not great according to the engine because it gives black the initiative. Black now gets to call the shots on the game, and white has to defend until he can either take over the initiative or trade off enough pieces where the initiative isn't as strong anymore. To start his initiative, black plays e5 in the center of the board. This hits the knight and forces it to back up. White plays knight f3, retempoing this pawn, and now black has to defend it. Or does he? Here, black can actually take on e4, because now, if white takes the pawn, then the bishop is hanging, and the pawn can take the bishop, and black is cleanly up a bishop. So, black has to respond to this threat by taking. This move is pretty much forced, otherwise he would lose the knight. Now black, continuing his initiative, trades queens. It may look strange to seasoned attacking chess players that white or black decides to trade queens, because it does give up any potential king attack. Most of the time you cannot attack the king without your queen. And it also surrenders this open file. Now this rook sees down this file, which is scarily close to the black king. But the idea behind this is very sound. Here, black finds the only good move, which is f5. f5 strikes into the center, and all of a sudden, there's nowhere good for the bishop to go. Now this bishop has nowhere good to go. If black's bishop goes back here, like this, there's just a fork here. The pawn hits both the knight and the bishop, and black will lose a piece. Same thing happens if black goes here with check. There's no good square, and the knight will just take the bishop. So white goes here. Now the plan is very clear for black. Black wants to trade this bishop in the middle, and then proceed to use these two powerful pawns in tempo on the rook to finish his development on his pieces after the rook takes. So black throws in an in-between move, or a Zwischenzug, e4. The idea which is to get this pawn off of this weakened square, so if this trade happens in the middle, this pawn can't be hit by the rook anymore. So the move is pretty much free because the knight has to move and respond to that threat. So the knight jumps into the middle. It is moderately powerful, but the squares that it controls are not very important. Black already hits this square twice. Black hits this square twice. Black defends this square with a pawn, and this square has no support to back it up. And so now he makes this trade in the middle, taking this and taking white's light squared bishop. White responds, takes the rook, but now black has control of what is called the bishop pair. So the bishop pair is when you have your two bishops still on the board, and you have managed to trade one of your knights for one of your opponent's bishops, here and here. And this is a concept that goes all the way back to the 19 and 1800s with Romantic era grandmasters and King's Gambit accepted and all that stuff. But the idea is that two bishops working in tandem is much more powerful than two knights working in tandem, or a bishop and a knight working in tandem. So if black can activate these bishops, they will be much more powerful than this bishop and knight. So black puts his bishop here, hitting the rook and forcing it away. White decides to go all the way back with his rook to d1, and black hops the knight in the middle, contesting the white knight. White takes, and black decides that his light squared bishop has done its job by kicking the rook out, so he takes this way. And the idea is to kind of reroute the bishop because it's less vulnerable on this diagonal if it were to go here eventually. It's less vulnerable here than it were to be here with moves like b3 and then b4 or a4, and it has to go somewhere. White develops a piece with knight c3, which is the best move according to the computer, just bringing another piece into the game. Black decides that he's kind of changed his mind. Now that the knight is out, he can bring his bishop here and hit this square and defend the knight from incurring on his weaker squares. That's exactly what happens. The knight jumps into the middle with support from the rook, and now black has to find another move to develop. Otherwise, white will counterattack, hitting this square. So black brings his rook over to c8, both defending this square and hitting the c2 pawn. White plays c3, and black plays bishop c5. And bishop c5, once again, justifying the rook going to c8, because now this bishop is forced away. And white does not want to let this trade happen, because once again, he's just going to have to move his knight back. And then black will have two active rooks, or have an active rook and an active bishop, and a grandmaster will know how to convert this advantage. So white is kind of in a bind here. He can't really do a lot with his pieces in the way of activation now. Can't move his rook to here, or a more active square, because of this laser beam. After this knight is forced away, this pawn will be very weak and winnable by the light squared bishop. His king's already safe, so that's not so much of an issue, but where's his light squared bishop, or dark squared bishop going to go? It's going to go here. What does that do? It doesn't do anything. It's just going to become a target there. And it might even be trapped after an idea like this, there, here, and here, and there. Nowhere for the bishop to go. So it's on a good square, still opposing the bishop, not letting it contest f2, but white still has some problems. White decides to expand on the king side with the very aggressive move h4. Now h4 is not a great move according to the computer. It's not impressed. But the idea is simple, or very clear at least, to bring his pawns down here and kind of cascade his pieces, cause chaos, and make it so his positional vulnerabilities aren't so important anymore because he's already attacking the black king. So here, Grandmaster Coupadze finds an excellent move. So the natural move would be to castle, kingside. Clearly just trying to activate your rook, defends this pawn, gets the king relatively safe. There's still a hole here, but your bishop covers it. But he sees the fact that the h-pawn means that white is going to try and launch an assault on his position over there. He also sees the fact that nobody is defending this bishop, which could come under fire during this attack. So he plays king f7. It looks very ludicrous. There are lines in here, there's a line here. King is kind of out in the open, not a lot of pawns around him. But the king is completely safe. Because of white's lack of activity in the position, that king can sit there and just be happy. He's safe, nothing's going to attack him, at least immediately. And now his rook has a path to get open. White decides to drop his knight back here, and black is completely unfazed. He says, you have a weakness on h4, you're going to need to compromise your position even more to defend it. So he plays bishop e7, hitting that pawn. And he is right. There's no good way to defend h4. The only way that you can actually defend it and avoid black going up a pawn is g3. And that weakens the king even more. Now there's a line in here for maybe the light squared bishop. Maybe you can land another piece, like a bishop, or maybe even a rook in the endgame on that square. There's no way to really bust out of here unless you divert a piece all the way back to rook f1, which gives up your only active piece, really. So now white is in some trouble. Black keeps up the pressure. Now that he's freed up his rook by putting his king on f7, he can bring his other final piece into the game, contesting white's only active piece that's actually playing and not just pretending to play. White decides to shut that down with bishop d4, hitting this pawn and just locking this in. This move does a little bit more harm than actual good because now his piece is gone. His only piece now controls two important squares. 3 if you count the bishop. Black reinforces his king side, and white plays b3. Of course, the bishop is now defending this pawn, so the rook can't take it. And so the idea is just to prevent the bishop from getting in here and on this long diagonal. Also, now the rook might be able to get into the game because this pawn prevents the bishop from hitting this weak pawn. Now black has decided that it is time to attack on the queen side. He plays b5. This locks down white's advancing pieces. He's going to have to do something to support a push if he wants to push at all, because any move like this gets immediately shut down by takes, and then black has a variety of options. He can take with tempo, he can really activate his bishop and make it super powerful, hitting his weakness. He can do a lot of things. Now white is backpedaling. He's got a clearly worse position to work from. Even if it's not totally losing yet, it is quite bad. So he decides to finally shut down this powerful bishop by taking and trading off his knight that he spent so many moves hopping around. King takes, and the king is still completely safe. Like, the rook is not going to get in here. The bishop can't attack it on a light square. Nobody's going to contest that king. Following up with this, white has to make something happen. So they strike in the center, trying to make use of the fact that this rook hasn't moved since the start of the game. And they're going to hit in the center with a4. Now black finds a very principled move that completely shuts it down and makes white's position look quite bad and very weak. See if you can find it. So the move is not taking on a4, because that solves white's problems. Now the rook can get in, hit this pawn, and attack this king, and white is justified. So instead, black finds b4, pushing the pawn, keeping this file closed, and now white is in some trouble, because the support of this bishop is going to run out, the rooks are going to run wild on white's side of the board, and it's a mess. And here, White makes his first blunder of the game. He made a few inaccuracies and one mistake, but this is his first true blunder in the game. Instead of taking, the engine said to take and try and hold this position, he decides to push his pawn and potentially try and hit this weakness in the future. Now let's look at why this is a blunder. The main thing is that it creates a backwards pawn right here on this file. So now if black ends up getting into white's position, this pawn will forever be weak. In addition to that, this backwards pawn cannot be defended by white's worst piece. So he's going to have to divert a whole rook, 5 points of material, to defending that piece, or that pawn. Otherwise, that pawn is going to be lost, and this pawn is going to march down the board and promote. So now black plays a very principled move. He sees that white has made a mistake, and he decides that he's going to up the ante. He sees that these two pieces are good here. This one holds in the pawn, and is kind of an attendant to the king, if you will. This one looks down the d-file, but essentially he's a rook up, because white is going to have to defend this b2 pawn with a rook. There's nothing else he can do. And so, black takes his other rook and decides to double on the d-file. He plays rook c6, white drops the bishop back, trying for a rook trade. Black decides, sure, we can trade, but it's going to be on my terms. So now if white wants to trade rooks, he's going to have to do it that way and surrender control of the d-file. So white takes and black takes. Material is still equal, but the engine has evaluated this as minus 1.6, which is almost completely losing according to computers and grandmaster level play. Now white has to make something happen. So he starts to bring his king into this losing endgame, trying to cause some chaos, try and get black to blunder something. And black, cool as ever, grandmaster plays rook d3. And that rook is a killer. It's on a very important file, it's on a very important rank, hits the weakness, is defended by this super powerful e4 pawn, and in addition to this, the king can't get in. The king, if he moves here, cannot get into the position. If he goes around, gets shut down here, gets shut down here, and so the king is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rook is going to have to defend this weakness, and black can decide what to do next. He has a variety of options. White goes rook b1, king d7. And that is clearly just trying to bring his king to this side of the board and work on this weak pawn triangle. White plays king e2. Still, it's a pretty empty threat, considering the fact that after rook here takes, black is still just so much better here. Brings a king, and the bishop is going to have to do a lot more than just sit here and pretend to be a pawn if white wants to even draw this. Black moves his king. Now it's even worse, because if the rook goes here, black will just take this pawn, and one pawn is all that a grandmaster needs to win against anybody. And then white goes rook b2. And that's all the better the rook can do. There is nowhere else for the rook to go. It can control these squares all it wants. Those aren't very valuable squares. And now black's bishop and his king are going to run wild as black's rook holds white's entire position in paralysis. There aren't pawn breaks. There is nothing here. Black brings his bishop, and white just moves back. There's nothing. Black decides to trade in the middle, getting rid of white's only good piece at this point in the game. And white decides to take back with the pawn, maybe trying to route his king, freeing up a new square for his king to maybe route this way. It does incur another terrible weakness here, and now his king is tied down too. Now black has a very clear plan. He did just march his king back this way on the queen side, but if he can get his king over here, the king will be uncontested. And this 4 pawns versus 2 pawns and 1 pawn, his pawn majority on this side of the board will win. It will win because even though he's not up a pawn, he holds 3 pawns against 2 pawns completely shut down. White has the advantage, as it does in most Sicilian positions, going all the way back to the opening. White has a queenside majority. 3 pawns versus 2 pawns. But of course, that majority doesn't matter because the pawns can't go anywhere. And so black wants to bring his king back this way, maybe win a pawn, and start pushing his pawns this way. There's one small flaw with that plan. If black is going to run his king to this side of the board, white can respond by playing rook d1. And now black's killer of a rook doesn't matter because he's going to have to trade it because of this pin on his king. So to prevent that, black plays rook c3. Now he does give up a little bit of space. He gives up a file and the king can move over here, and that's exactly what he does. But it's better in the long run. The rook is still defended, it's still a killer, it still hits both of these weaknesses, and now the king can move this direction. Black goes here, white just shuffles, and black is starting to build up his attack over here. King goes back, black responds by doing this, and the king slides back here. White is pretty much moving back and forth, waiting for the inevitable. Black decides that this pawn trade is worth it for him because now he has a majority and he's going to get a pass pawn no matter how you slice it. If black goes here, there is nothing. If you trade once, you take. These 2 pawns are just overpowering. Even if you win this pawn is now uncontested and will promote faster than this pawn if this pawn doesn't lose. So white plays a waiting move. It's a move that isn't of a lot of importance. The idea is that you just control these. Now the king can't get in, and this pawn can't support this pawn. But white can't get active enough for that to actually matter. Now black is finally initiating his master plan of bringing the king to the other side of the board. King goes here. White responds, and black goes there. This is actually a concept called distant opposition. And the idea is that once all the pieces are removed, all other moves are exhausted, these 2 kings will oppose each other. And no matter whose turn it is, black will have opposition on the white king. Of course, white is forced to make a move, so he has to just shuffle back to here. And then black strikes here, preparing the pawn push with f4. White plays the rook back because he can't do anything. And now this push finally happens. There's nothing that white can do because there will be a passed pawn, and that will be the end for white. So white takes, black takes, white takes with check, and black takes. And this pawn is going to decide the game. And so white is in desperation mode. He's got nothing. He's just going to keep trying to get behind the black's position. And so he decides to go rook f1 check, sacrificing the pawn on b3. Black goes here. White drops his drops his rook all the way back to the last rank. Black picks up the pawn. White hits the a6 pawn, but this is all irrelevant. Black can go here. And now, after rook takes, there is e3 check. King is in a bad place. No rook to defend it even. Has to go back in front of the pawn, preventing it from moving forward and promoting. Black plays rook b2 check. Now the king has to slide back to the final rank, because if he goes here, the pawn will just promote, If he goes there, then the king will come, and the rook will be put on the first rank, and there's nothing that he can do. So white decides to go here, still trying to block this pawn from getting in. Now black brings his second pawn. Black does not care about this pawn. He could pick that up and be up a pawn, but it's irrelevant. It's too far away